David, before he became a king, he was a worshiper, a skillful worshiper. And though he became a king over Israel, and he had accolades, exaltations, excellency, and money, wealth, treasures, fortunes. He won victories over nations. He subdued kings and kingdoms, princes and princesses. He stood tall among all the kings of the earth. He was one of the greatest of all kings in his time and in his days. And yet, irrespective of the excellency, the wealth, the treasures, the victories, the triumph, the accolades, and everything he had and possessed, it did not change him. It didn't stop him from being a worshiper. It did not stop him from taking note and from giving God credit for who he was and for who he became. He never took credit for anything. He recognized the works, the goodness of God in his life. It had nothing to do with his achievement. And like Paul said the other day, I am what I am by the grace of God. And the Bible said, for it is not to him that willeth, nor to him that runneth, but to God that showeth mercy. And the Bible said, what have you that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why then do you boast? And why do you act as if you did not receive it? David was a king with a difference. He did not allow the position, the fortunes of life, the status of life, of greatness, access, influence, and everything he was and he became to get into his head. He never forgot his humble beginnings and where he came from. I'm a king. I command wealth. I am the captain and commander of the armed forces of the state of Israel. And yet, I will bless the Lord at all times. I have a very busy schedule. I have kings paying courtesy calls on me. I have ambassadors representing nations paying courtesy call on me. Yet, in the midst of my busy schedule, I will bless the Lord at all times. This was a king speaking. This wasn't just an ordinary man. This king was a king, a prophet, and a priest. He was the only king in the Bible who was a priest, a prophet, and a king compared to that of Jesus' standard. A king was a skillful worshiper. How skillful is our worship? David was a skillful worshiper. Are you a skillful worshiper? And who do you worship? Do you worship yourself? Do you worship your achievements? Do you worship your accomplishment? Do you worship your principles? Do you worship your righteousness? Who do you worship? Do you worship money? Do you worship things? Or do you worship the living God, the only true God, Adonai, El Elyon, the God of the armies of Israel? Who do you worship? Boast of chariots, some boast of horses, some boast of money, and some boast of achievement and background. But David said, for me, my trust and my confidence is in the Lord. And God said, I don't judge and I don't measure people by the color of their skin or their actions or how they look or how they present themselves. I judge motives and I look at the conditions of the hearts of men. That was one of the things that made David a man after God's own heart, that he had a heart for God. Do you have a heart for God? Do you have a heart for others? Do you have a heart for the work of God? What do you have a heart for? David had a heart for God. Please, I'm not pleased with this king called Saul. He was a man of stature, and he stood tall among all the men of Israel. And yet God was displeased with him because he was into himself. He was selfish. He was into accolades and name, relevance, and how people saw him, and he was concerned about public opinion of himself than God's opinion of him. And God said, I will replace him with a shepherd from the backside of the desert. I will replace him with one that has a heart for me. I will replace him with one that have reverence, gratitude, respect for me. One that recognizes that who one is in life has nothing to do with how disciplined or principled you are, but it's had everything to do with God showing you mercy. Because there are many better, intelligent, skillful, wiser than you that have not accomplished nor obtained the exposure, the favor, and the level of success you have. So learn to be thankful. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't deserve anything. I don't deserve anything. It is just an act of grace and an act of mercy. That's why Paul the apostle said the other day, he said, I am what I am by the grace of God. It is not by what I studied at the feet of Gamaliel. It is not because of my accomplishment or IQ or skill, but I am what I am by the grace of God. I am the product of grace. And that is the way God feels. And that's why David was a special individual after his own heart. That David was one that remembered, was one that always came back to say thank you, was one that was always grateful and did not allow the prestige, the status he attained in life meant nothing. The access, the influence, the exposure, the excellency, none of these things got to him. He recognized that he was a shepherd. And every now and then, God will remind David and said, remember, David, remember. Remember, for I took you from the sheepfold and gave you your master's throne and gave you the wives of your master. Remember. It's a sin to forget. The Bible said God is not unrighteous to forget our labor of love. Whenever we forget, we become unrighteous. It means that to remember, to show gratitude is one of the acts of righteousness. And ingratitude is an act of unrighteousness. So let's remember that it is not him that willeth, nor him that runneth, but that God that showeth mercy. We can make the world a better place if we would just forget about ourselves a little bit. If we would stop being self-centered and selfish and greedy and be selfless, like the Mandelas who live in their days, who was told after being in prison for 27 years that Mr. President or Mr. Mandela, you are free to go home after 27 years of being incarcerated, to spend time with your family, your wives and your grandchildren that you haven't seen for decades. And Mr. Mandela said, if my freedom don't set the people for which I've been in prison free, then I don't want to be free. He said, I don't want to be free if my people will still stay under the rule of apartheid, if my people will still be treated as animals and not as human beings, then I don't want to be free. I will remain in prison until my freedom determines the freedom of others. I will stay in prison.